Fractions. We meet once again. Wonderful fractions. In the last video, I taught you about how to utilize fraction circles to teach your students fractions. And I think that they are absolutely great, but then there's something better. There are these wonderful things called pattern blocks. Today, I'm going to teach you how to use pattern blocks to teach your students to love fractions. And this is what this is all about. Hello, fabulous teachers. My name is Canissa Grant, and I am a math specialist who specializes in teaching math to students with disabilities and ELL students. Today, I'm really going to emphasize the importance and the fabulosity of these wonderful things called pattern blocks. In the fractions unit, it can be very complicated for students to really understand what fractions are because they're so abstract, and when you have those complicated math problems like 1/2 and 1/3 and 2/5, right, what does that actually mean? Pattern blocks allow students to actually visualize what the fractions are by actually breaking up something that is realistic, like a pattern block. And I want to make sure that all teachers have the ability to utilize these manipulatives in their classroom because they're fantastic. Another thing I want to add to this is that all of the resources that you are going to be learning today are going to be provided in the middle school mathematics toolbox, which is going to contain the manipulatives. It's going to contain how-to videos and worksheets that are really accessible to all of your students. So this is going to be an activity specifically for you and your students. This is my gift to you. The importance of actually utilizing these visual math resources is because we want to make math accessible for everybody. And that's our job as teachers. We're trying to help our students love math, not hate it. So I'm going to get into this tutorial, and if you would like to have access to any of the middle school mathematics teacher resources in that fabulous toolbox I'm creating for you, I'll create a link in the course module for you guys to be able to access. Okay, so make sure you check that out, and let's get right into the video. Alright, so now let's get into the tutorial on how to use the pattern blocks to teach fractions. So you need to have all of your pattern blocks, and you can purchase these pattern blocks on Amazon, or you can use the digital version that's included in the middle school mathematics toolbox that I'm going to provide for you. So let's get started. So the first thing I would do is utilize the explicit instruction of telling your students what each pattern block means. Right? So for example, right, we're going to represent this hexagon as a whole, okay? So this hexagon is going to represent a whole, okay? And then what I would do is I would compare, right, the different parts here, right? So if this rhombus here, right, what does this represent? Well, this represents 1/3 of this hexagon, okay? So, and even for students who really are not understanding and need some context for it, I would even go as far as labeling these with the different types of fractions, just so that they know. Okay, and then I would use pieces like the trapezoid, okay, and the triangles as well. And these are the main pieces I'm going to utilize in this tutorial, just to have students understand the different parts here. And then I would go as far as going into how do we represent fractions using these pattern blocks. So the first step to this is going through the process. So this represents a whole, okay, and then this represents 1/3, okay. So and then this will represent 1/6. So you're seeing the different relationships between the different fractions so that students can see this. And I would go as far as overlaying them just like I did with the fraction tiles so that they can see the relationship, right? So if this is 1/3 of this whole thing, that means that this triangle has to be 1/6. So making that relationship, and then the trapezoid is going to represent a half. And then how do we represent different types of fractions here, right? So here, what we would do, right? What would the two rhombuses represent? That would be 2/3. Okay, and then how do we represent something like 4/6? What I would do is I would always compare it to the whole, because in order to conceptualize this, I tell students, oh, okay, fractions are basically breaking down what a whole is, right? How do you break the whole into parts? Okay, so if you have 4/6 here, you can see that, right? You can represent it like that, right? So that students understand the concept. The direct and explicit instruction will definitely inform your students and help them be able to understand the context for how to multiply and add and divide fractions when you go into it. They have to know what each one of these individual pieces mean in order for them to understand how to do the operations. So that's the first step that you should take. All right, so the next step to teach students how to use the pattern blocks is teaching them operations. So the first operation I always like to start with that students are most familiar with is adding. So what I like to do is I like to take the individual parts. I'm going to take two trapezoids here, and I'm going to show each one is going to represent 1/2, right? So 2 halves, if you add those together, make 1 whole. Okay, and I'm going to use the hexagon to represent that. So then I layer the 2 halves on top of the whole there, just to show students that you can add, that's how you add the fractions. Okay, now that is if you have the common denominators, right? But what if you have two denominators that are different? Well, we can take the 1/3, right, which is represented by this rhombus here. Then we can take one of the triangles to represent the 1/6, okay? So what's going to happen here is we're going to basically add these together, and then I'm going to take out my whole again just so everyone can see how this is represented. And if you take a look at this, right, you're adding a 6 and a 3rd together. If you take a look at this, you're going to ask students, okay, what does this look similar to, right? And what it looks similar to is this trapezoid, right? You can literally lay this on top of it and then ask them, what does this trapezoid represent? Well, this trapezoid represents a half. So when you add a 3rd and a 6th, you get a half. So that's one of the operations I like to show so that students understand how to add. And adding is one of the first operations that they're going to learn. So they're most familiar with it, and they've had a lot of time, especially when they've been in the 5th and 6th grade and beyond, they're most familiar with the adding. So that's where I would start first. The next part I would go with is multiplying. Okay, so I'm going to multiply a mixed number. And you can introduce mixed numbers. And I'm going to write the formulas on the top of the page so that you guys can see this. But basically, I'm going to multiply 3 and 1/3 times 1/2. So basically, what you're going to teach your students is, what does that even mean, right? So you're taking a half of 3 and 1/3. Okay, so you're going to represent that based on the wholes here, right? So you're going to need 4 of these, and you're taking halves of these, right? So you could take half of the 3 okay? Because you did the direct instruction, your students are going to be able to understand that this is how it's represented, okay? Move this over just a little bit. So now that you have this clarified for your students, what's going to end up happening is you're going to basically take this last hexagon, and you're going to add a 3rd onto it to represent the 3rd in the equation, okay? So now that you have this, what we can do is we can consolidate this, right? Because this is all broken down. So you say, how can we consolidate this and make this a little bit smaller? But students will already recognize from the direct instruction that you can combine the 2 trapezoids together to get 1. And then you're left with something like this. So I'm going to take out these holes here. And go back up here. Okay, and basically going back to the beginning of what we just did is we represented, right, that we took halves of the whole. Okay, and let me just go through that one more time here, just so you can utilize and see that part here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a half of this, a half of this, a half of this, and if you take half of 1/3 here, and this represents the third, right? And you take half of that, you're gonna get a sixth. So that's where we got that from, just so we can just clarify that and make it a lot easier to understand. So just like I explained before, we're going to combine all of the different parts, take out the wholes here, and then this is the representation, right? So what we have here is we have representation where we have a whole here, okay, and then we also have a half and a sixth, right? So what's going to end up happening is you're going to basically break down this half. I was like, how can we break down to make it look like the sixth here? So here, and then what do we have as a result? Well, if one of these represents a six and we have four of them, that represents 4 6. So students can see that relationship using the pattern blocks and basically understand how what this represents. So we represent 1 and 4 6. Okay, so this is how we actually utilize the pattern blocks to represent multiplication. The last one I like to focus on is division. In this process, what I'm going to use is the equation 1 1/3 divided by 2. So the 1, right, and 1/3 is represented by this hexagon, and the third is represented by the rhombus. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to show what this represents. Can we break down this hexagon into rhombuses? Yeah, we can. We can use these rhombuses here, and we can fit 2 of them on here. But what about the missing spaces? And students will be able to say, oh, maybe a triangle can fit in there. So basically what we're doing is we're dividing the whole into parts. And students should be able to see that relationship using the pattern blocks. Okay? So now that we have this, what I would do is I'd be like, okay, so let's take this out and let's break this down. Okay? So let's take out the individual parts. And then what students should realize is that you can also combine the rhombus, the 2 triangles into a rhombus. And students can see that. So now that we have that representation, we can get rid of this and we can go back to the original equation and say, okay, what is it asking us, right? It's asking us to divide that 1 1/3 into a half. Well, how we divide this into half? We take the 2 rhombuses and we divide them into the half here. So you guys can see it. Okay. All right. So what does this actually represent? Right? What does the half represent? Well, if each one of these is a third, if you have 2 of them, that represents 2/3. So what you're left over with is 2/3. So when you divide 1 1/3, you divide into 2 and you get 2/3. So students can actually see this using these pattern blocks. This is why they're such a wonderful tool for students to understand how to do fractions. For students who struggle with interpreting the different parts of the fractions and things like that, what I would do is I would actually have them label each one of these. So label this as a sixth, label this as a 1/3. Or if they're having some issues visually, what I would do is I would verbally tell them these are the fractions, and they would be able to interpret it that way. And then making it easier for students, if you go into talking about word problems, you'll be able to scaffold using these different blocks to be able to have them interpret what word problems actually means. In the next tutorial, I'm going to tell you guys more about how to utilize the manipulatives in math problems and how easy it is to actually use visual math to interpret word problems by just being able to break it down. Also providing interventions for bilingual learners and having them learn literacy through the word problems in math. So this is the end of the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Hello again, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on how to teach your students fraction using pattern blocks. Aren't they wonderful? Aren't they really fabulous? Aren't you excited to go into your classroom and utilize these pattern blocks with your students? I love doing it. It's one of the best lessons that I teach. I love teaching fractions because of these manipulatives. If you want more resources, I have an entire resource, an entire toolbox with all of these fabulous videos, worksheets, and manipulatives for your students called the Middle School Mathematics Toolbox. And it's specifically designed for you. I teach you how to use the manipulatives, I provide you with the manipulatives, and I provide other resources to support ELL and students with disabilities as well. Are you ready to take the challenge and make sure that you have all the information? Make sure that you access the Middle School Mathematics Toolbox utilizing the link that's above here, and it's also included in your course. Thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure to teach you guys, and always remember, mathematics is fun.